This is Chapter 15, the bureaucracy. The first thing we will do is we will look at the size and power of the bureaucracy. Note the questions: who governs and to what ends. Those are important for study. Okay. A bureaucracy, as we know it, is a large organization composed of appointed officials in which authority is divided among several managers. Bureaucracy is an obvious feature of all modern societies, but the United States governmental bureaucracy is distinctive in three ways. First, political authority over the bureaucracy is shared among several institutions. Second, most federal agencies share their functions with agencies of state and local government. And finally, America's adversary culture means that the actions of bureaucrats are often fought in court. The Constitution makes little mention of the bureaucracy, other than to give the president power to appoint various sorts of officials. In 1789, Congress gave the president power to remove officials without congressional assent. But the question of who, if anyone, would actually control the bureaucracy has continued to be hotly contested. Throughout most of American history, patronage was the chief means of determining who would hold federal jobs. Congress was the dominant institution. The president usually accommodated congressional preferences in appointments, and thus appointments were made to reward local supporters of Congress members or to build up local party organizations. By the middle of the 19th century, there were a lot of federal jobs. From 1816 to 1861, the number of federal employees increased eightfold, with the post office accounting for most of this increase. The Civil War and post-war period saw the creation of many additional bureaus. A strong commitment to laissez-faire meant that these agencies did not, for the most part, regulate, but rather served specialized constituencies such as farmers or veterans. The bureaucracy as we know it today is most clearly the product of the New Deal and the Great Society, whose programs gave broad but vaguely defined powers to agencies, and of World War II, during which the government made use of the vastly increased revenues the income tax allowed. The Supreme Court has interceded to restrict political patronage on constitutional grounds. The first was taken in a case called Elrod v. Burns, 1976, in which the court noted that important First Amendment interests in the protection of free speech must be taken into account and into consideration in patronage firings. According to the majority, the public's interest in the effective implementation of policy can be fully satisfied by limiting patronage dismissals to policy-making positions. 4 years later, in 1980, in Branty v. Finkel, the Supreme Court elaborated by explaining that, quote, the question is whether the hiring authority can demonstrate that party affiliation is an appropriate requirement for the effective performance of the office, unquote. As such, the mere fact that a bureaucrat occupied a policy-making position no longer constituted the ultimate factor in a patronage firing. This line of cases was brought to conclusion with Rutan v. Republican Party of Illinois in 1990, when the court extended the Branty standard to, quote, promotion, transfer, recall, and hiring decisions based on party affiliation and support, unquote. Thus, patronage has reached the point of nearly political extinction, at least as far as the court is concerned. Now remember, we do have the 9/11 effect, all right, in the control of the bureaucracy. The 9/11 attacks affected the bureaucracy as profoundly as World War II and the Depression. You have a new cabinet agency known as the Department of Homeland Security, which was created. The centralization of intelligence gathering activities come under a single director. But the General Accounting Office issued a report which was very critical of the Department of Homeland Security for continuing management problems and controlling the diverse array of counterterrorism agencies. People often think of big government in terms of the size of the bureaucracy, but number of civilian and federal employees has not been growing since World War II. What has increased is the number of indirect federal employees, those working for state or local governments or private firms funded by federal programs. However, the power of the bureaucracy is a function not of its size, but of the degree to which appointed officials have discretionary authority, the ability to choose courses of actions, and to make policies not spelled out in advance by laws. The vast increase in expenditures channeled through the bureaucracy, as well as the vast expansion in the number of regulations issued during the past 30 years, shows that the bureaucracy has indeed become very powerful. Theme B is the control of the bureaucracy. The first thing we need to talk about is recruitment and retention, or recruitment and reward. In the 19th century, presidents could appoint virtually every federal employee on the basis of patronage. The federal bureaucrats exercise a great deal of power. It is therefore important to understand the influences of bureaucratic conduct. 4 factors explain the behavior of government officials, and recruitment and reward, or retention, is the first one. This practice early on became referred to as the spoil system. It was based on the belief that a winning candidate was entitled to reward supporters. Government employment could function in this manner for 2 reasons. First, the number of federal employees was small, making a relatively wholesale change of personnel a simple task to accomplish. And second, the jobs required little expertise or specialized knowledge, with the Postal Service accounting for over 2/3 of all positions. The spoiled system became obsolete as the size of the federal government spiraled after the Civil War, and as professional training became necessary to perform the more complex tasks assigned the federal bureaucracy. The Pendleton Act, enacted in 1883, began the process of transferring federal hiring to a merit system. Once hired, a federal bureaucrat normally serves a 1-year trial period before being granted tenure. A tenured bureaucrat is extremely difficult to fire, with the average termination process, including appeals, lasting about 2 years. Thus, in practice, almost no one is ever fired, and executives develop informal strategies for dealing with incompetent employees. The Senior Executive Service was created in 1978 to provide presidents with a core group of neutral professional managers in the upper grades of the bureaucracy. To ensure competence, members of the SES who join on a voluntary basis are subject to easier transfer and firing procedures, as well as to pay increases determined by performance. The SES has not worked out as intended, however. Almost no member of the group has been fired, and salary raises have been fairly automatic. In spite of the merit system, hiring in federal agencies remains political, especially at the middle and upper levels. An agency can hire a particular individual on a name-request basis, giving rise to the buddy system. This practice allows the maintenance of issue networks based on shared policy views. Bureaucrats and consumer protection agencies, for example, may hire people from public interest groups. The end product of the recruitment and reward structure is that most bureaucrats become quite comfortable in their position and defensive of their agency, adopting an agency point of view. Before we go on to the federal bureaucracy today, we need to mention personal attributes. Bureaucrats at the middle and upper levels of government are not representative of the American public. They tend to be highly educated, middle-aged white males. But none of these factors explains much about the attitudes bureaucrats hold. Surveys have found top-level bureaucrats to be slightly more liberal than the average voter, but not as liberal as members of the media. Yet even this generalization is a bit misleading. Attitudes tend to vary depending on the agency for which a bureaucrat works. Those employed by activist agencies and departments such as the FTC or the EPA are much more liberal than those who work in traditional agencies and departments. While attitudes differ, they do not necessarily influence bureaucratic behavior, because much of bureaucratic work is governed by standardized rules and procedures. It is only where rules are loosely structured that a civil servant's attitudes come into play. The nature of the job. Some agencies have a sense of mission, a clear doctrine that is shared by its members. Such agencies, which include, for example, the FBI or Public Health Service or the Forest Service, are easy to manage and have high morale, but are hard to change and are resistant to political direction. To be sure, a sense of mission probably infiltrates most agencies to some degree. An agency's mission must be accomplished within an array of laws, rules, and regulations, dealing with hiring and firing, freedom of information, accounting for money spent, affirmative action, environmental impact, and administrative procedures. Agencies also have overlapping and even conflicting missions. These characteristics make controlling the bureaucracy difficult, no matter which party occupies the White House. There are also external forces. All government bureaus must cope with 7 external forces: executive branch superiors, the president's staff, congressional committees, interest groups, the media, the courts, and other government agencies. All federal agencies are nominally subordinate to the president. In practice, agencies that distribute benefits among significant discrete groups, regions, or localities within the United States, such as HUD, Agriculture, and Interior, tend to be closely overseen by Congress and are correspondingly oriented toward the Congress. Others, such as State, Treasury, or Justice, are more under the control of the President and are oriented more toward the President. Bureaucrats, like people, generally desire autonomy. To be left alone, free of bureaucratic rivals, and close political supervision. They may obtain autonomy through the skillful use of publicity to build public support, such as NASA. A less risky strategy is to develop strong allies in the private sector that will provide political support in Congress. However, this limits the freedom of the agency. It must serve the interests of its clients. Thus, for example, the Maritime Administration supports high subsidies for the shipping industry, and the Department of Labor could never recommend a decrease in the minimum wage.